Sonja, is that pronounced correctly?
That's totally correctly.
All right.
Sonja.
And Miettinen?
Miettinen.
Miettinen.
Miettinen. Exactly.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, welcome. How are you this beautiful day?
I'm perfectly fine today. It's very cloudy here in Sweden today, but it's perfect otherwise.
Well, I'm in upstate New York. It's perfectly here, and it's quite commonly cloudy. And yesterday it was a beautiful, cool, sunny day, and we'll see what today brings for all of us.
Exactly. That's so true. How lovely.
It's beautiful. Well, we're recording and we're sharing it with our community, your community, the global community on health and wellness.
That's perfect.
That's perfect. Well, can you tell all of our communities a little bit about yourself and why you are in this space of health and wellness?
Absolutely. So my name is Sonja, and I'm originally actually from Finland, and I've been living in Sweden the past 8 years now, and I'm health coach, and I'm actually currently also doing my master's degree in food and nutrition science here in University of Gothenburg. And my focus is very much in animal-based nutrition. Autoimmune diseases are especially on the increase. And my interest lies a lot on thyroid health, hormonal problems, for example, PCOS, endometriosis, also gut issues, anemia, alopecia, and so on. And that's also kind of like the background that I have with very many autoimmune diseases that have kind of like pushed me to work on this field. And I'm having a page, Instagram page called The Crown Health. And I focus a lot on posting on different studies there and highlighting problems that I experience that we have in terms of nutritional recommendations. And I post also examples on how I eat, different recipes. But also I kind of like try to understand the issue with the plant-based narrative that we are very much relying on in terms of the recommendations today. So I would kind of like describe myself as a person who loves digging into information, and I like science, I love science, and that's I kind of like want to keep the science present in what I talk and what I post. And the information I'm posting is, of course, also very educational.
Mhm.
And I kind of like hope that it's very eye-opening also for people. And yeah, I think that the mainly the biggest problem that we have in nutritional science is that it's quite biased today, and we are very much relying on this diet heart hypothesis. So basically that we should replace saturated fat with vegetable oils, very rich in linoleic acid, and this should then reduce coronary heart diseases. So this is the areas that I'm talking about, that why we should kind of like see in a different perspective than taking this narrative as the truth.
What type of diseases have you suffered from that sort of pushed you into this world of understanding the science of nutrition and explaining the diseases?
Yeah, so well, that's there's many things going on there, I would say. So so first of all, my father has common variable immune deficiency diseases called CVID, and this is a primary immune deficiency disease, and this is characterized by low levels of protective antibodies and increased risk of infections. And I have some predisposition due to his disease. So I was born about 1 month earlier than expected through C-section, and I think that that's also something that has provoked that it has had an effect on probably on my microbiota and increased incidence of autoimmune disorders. So I was in a very young age, I was only 2 years old, and I was diagnosed with celiac disease. So basically I've been gluten-free for my whole life. And in about when I was 8 years old, I was diagnosed with the hypothyroidism, or actually the autoimmune variant Hashimoto. So I had a very aggressive inflammation at the time going on, and that had probably been going on for several years already, because I had symptoms when I was a kid. My parents were very they didn't really know that what's wrong. My mom tried to kind of like push the the medical system to kind of like check my thyroid values, but it's not that common that such a young kid has thyroid issues. But in any case, I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's at a very young age. I was very often feeling sick. I have like cognitive problems. It was hard to concentrate at school, especially when the hypothyroidism was like at its worst. At the moment, I have it under control, and it's been, of course, during the years, it has been a roller coaster in many ways. Then in my late teens, I had problems with hypothalamic amenorrhea. So basically, I had the absence of menstruation, and that, of course, affected all of my life. Then, I mean, when you are young, you kind of like think that, well, it's nice that you don't have menstruation. But of course, you kind of like start to understand, but this is not normal anymore.
Right.
And it took several years before I got my period back, actually. And there also is one of the biggest problem I see, that it's kind of like, okay, you need to eat more carbs. I was just like shuffling more carbs into my systems, and I had my normal weight. I even had like higher fat percent, that I just couldn't get my period back anymore. I cut down my training and everything. It didn't come back. So this kind of like more carbs, less fat, more vegetable oils, less protein. It didn't really work for me at all. And then later on, I started to get problems with eosinophilic esophagitis. So I had some inflammation in my esophagus, and I had some mild gastritis and constipation. And of course, the treatment to this was, let's give her more fiber.
Right.
And that got like, the situation got worse. I already was eating a lot of, these kind of like big salads, and then some protein, always meat or something, but very much vegetables. And fiber just made me worse all the time. And of course, due to the inflammation, I was put on corticosteroids, and this, after all, then had also an effect that I actually by accident took a DEXA scanning as a part of my studies, and I have much lower bone density than I should have. And I was thinking that, okay, so this is happening as well. Of course, my other diseases might also have affected that. But I don't really think that the cortisol or putting me on those medications was the right decision, because doctors told me that you cannot do anything with your diet. You just eat smaller portions and several meals per day, and that's it. And I just felt that there's something wrong with all this.
So the advice you were given, here are the drugs, the diet is just, you're not doing it right in some way, or you have to keep on doing more of it.
Exactly.
And yet you sound like you were suffering more and more and more.
Exactly. I was suffering more and more. And I actually took up this with dietary changes, because when I was very young, I already started in my teens look at ketogenic diets, for example, paleo diet. And at the time, we didn't talk, there wasn't that much information about that, at least when I was 15, 16, 17, 18, I mean, people didn't talk that much about that in my friends and so on. Instead, it was very much focusing on eating green smoothies and so on. So I told also doctors that I've been interested in low carb diets, and I got a total no. That's not the way to do it. I mean, just follow what the food agencies are saying, what the recommendations are. And I felt that, okay, should I follow what I feel better? Because I started to cut some food triggers, and it was very much based on higher carb foods.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt better. And the interesting thing is that I even had a appointment with a dietitian, and I was thinking that it's interesting to hear what kind of like opinion they have on this dietary issue. And I got kind of like a total no on animal fats, that you should cut down your saturated fats. And I said that I have started to implement more, for example, tallow. I eat a lot of tallow, suet, and it was no. I mean, just try to implement more nuts and seeds and olive oil, rapeseed oil, and so on in your diet. And I was just like shocked by this, because if I'm going back to this thing, I'm going to be back in the where I begin my my health journey, basically.
Where did you start hearing about the keto, paleo, and animal meats and fat based?
So this was I actually started to research a lot on my own, and at the time I think that there were, for example, what's the guy called, Thomas DeLauren, for example, Ben Bickman. There was a Finnish doctor called Antti Heikkilä, who was talking about lower carb diets, and very controversial in Finland, actually. Stephanie Keto person. So I was very much into this kind of like ketogenic diet area before going into carnivore. Also in Sweden, there was Martina Johansson, Tommi Kokko in Finland, Tim Noakes, Nina Theisholz, Mark Sisson. So these people, I started to kind of like research more what they talked about the nutrition, and then I started to read more on myself. And actually, at the point, also I'll comment on my disease background. So around 4 years ago, so I started to also have endometriotic pain, and at the time I didn't really know what is this pain. This is a different kind of like character of a pain. So, and also PCOS symptoms. So I had some ovarian cysts problems with that, and that was also interesting because there is no discussion on dietary changes. How should you be eating in terms of endometriosis? It's very often linked to, for example, gut issues like irritable bowel syndrome, which I had symptoms of. Also, that you have blood glucose problems, but this no one talked about it. It was the first thing to do is to take a hormonal treatment. It's the only option. But I did actually start doing some changes in my diet, and I got, for example, cutting out carbs much helped a lot. And at the moment, I've been pretty much pain-free for a couple of years just due to that. And also I had some histamine intolerance, which also I have seen in studies might appear with the endometriosis. So you need to be very careful with high histamine foods. So there are so many different things happening now there that, I mean, and of course it can become like a big roller coaster. But the one common denominator for all of my problem has been that I've been doing a lower fat diet. I have had a very high intake of vegetables, and especially raw vegetables, and high fiber, and my digestion hasn't working properly.
And it started at a very young age that the problems, and it's sort of gone from thyroid to endometriosis, bowel disorders. So how are you putting this all together in sort of your driving force of the decision to become a nutritional coach and focus your studies on all of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, of course, having self-experiment for such a many years has given me quite a lot of experience of what works and what not. And that's kind of like, I don't want people to end up in a situation where they have to go through that much of trial and error, and also kind of like fight with doctors on what might be the underlying reason. So I mean, that's also some kind of like empowerment that you can control your own health, and it's actually quite basic things that you can do. And I hope to be kind of like help people to find some trigger points in their diet, which are very often related to that they have some kind of like gut issues, especially what I see many women, and especially if they have any kind of like endometriosis problem, they are having gut issues. They have very much of bloating, they don't digest the food, many might get some kind of like allergic reactions after they eat. And of course, when you kind of like add up things, it's hard to anymore know what's causing what. And that's why sometimes, I mean, eliminating stuff and kind of like going back to basics is helping. So for me to kind of like have my own experiences as seeing what's happening and kind of like relating that also to what science says and what studies says, but also, of course, what other people have experienced, has kind of like given me a background to kind of like, okay, there's something to work on in this field, and starting to also my studies in food and nutrition science has of course given me this kind of like scientific way of thinking, but also to know handling the information, and which has helped me a lot, you know, to kind of like be somewhere in the middle, to have my own experiences, but still keeping the, you know, the scientific points and the scientific facts with me. And it's been hard because, I mean, of course, for me, I have a different perspective than the very much plant-based dogma that's actually today we are talking a lot about, and which also I see in food and nutrition science, that a lot of focus goes on that very often. I mean, I hear it daily that we need to cut out meat. No one's talking about, well, what's the nutritional value of organ meats? What's the nutritional value of meat? I mean, why are we depleting, you know, people, making them feel worse? It's something that I couldn't just understand, and that's why also I wanted to kind of like put myself into this situation to help people, and hopefully also educate people on kind of like finding ways to see the nutrition in from different perspectives, and of course also relating to my own experiences.
You're in a traditional nutrition, food and science educational platform, which tell us a little bit about how, because that's the general dogma in the nutritional science world is, as you said, plant-based, low animal fat to no animal fat. And are you able to at least do some work within that frame, or are you finding yourself have to move more outside of it?
I definitely feel that I can work even in that field. Actually, there are several smaller studies that I've done during my years on food and nutrition science, where I have also discussed the very controversial areas within the nutrition science, and that's also been, of course, the discussion between professors and me sometimes, and sometimes I feel that they also need to, you know, stop and think about things. Can this really make sense? I mean, that we are recommending these things. Sometimes there are a lot of, you know, people don't want to even hear a different perspective, so that they're very biased on even discussing about the different aspects. But what I have seen, for example, in terms of endometriosis, for example, so I made a study, my bachelor thesis on that, and it's interesting because in that study, of course, because I have myself endometriosis, I kind of like wanted to see what kind of like symptoms, gut-related symptoms women have, what kind of like food-related, how is food related to the symptoms that they get, and how do their meal patterns affect their pain and so on. So I had in this study, I had 90 women from Finland and Sweden. And what is interesting is that, and also, I mean, in terms of working within the food and nutrition science, I could see things that also give me some kind of like clarification on that, that the plant-based dogma is somehow failing, because there were women who had higher, for example, higher intake of fiber, and they say that they have very severe pain during the flare-ups and during the so-called normal weeks, compared to persons, or compared to the women who had less pain, who had less fiber in their diet. So that's also kind of like, I'm trying to kind of like work what I in these questions in terms of plant-based diets and more animal-based diets, to kind of like see what kind of like habits people have, what kind of like symptoms they have, and that's also raises questions. I mean, the results that I got from this small study showed pretty clearly that that the higher intake of plant-based foods, and especially food maps, for example, these fermentable carbohydrates, had a huge effect on how much pain people have. And of course, this becomes also discussion within the academia then, somehow, because it's almost hard to them to kind of like say, okay, but we are recommending these women to have a healthy diet with the following the food pyramid, having mainly vegetables, building your plate first, vegetables, raw vegetables, cooked vegetables, and then having the smallest part for protein from meat and so on. It's not working. So I think that it's good still that I'm kind of like generating some discussion and interest even in people who are not really much, accepting this thinking.
You think part of the problem may be that we've created this term healthy diet, healthy lifestyle, and everyone's following that term, and yet they're getting sicker. And so then there's this link, well, I must just be genetically predisposed to this, and I'm unlucky because my genetics are the problem. Where are you seeing the science world? Are there any cracks beginning to open up in the world you're in changing the paradigm?
Absolutely. I definitely feel that there are some cracks opening up at the moment. I mean, of course, I would still say that it depends also who are going into the science. I mean, it's very much people who have some sort of an interest in health, I would say so. And I mean, in general, I see that people who, for example, are within food and nutrition science and probably are dietitians, they have some sort of plant-based background, might be very much. But it's interesting that when you kind of like get you bring up the studies for these people, it's they also have to kind of like think that, okay, both the sustainability aspect but also the symptom aspect. I can like see some sort of we see an association with increasing autoimmune diseases. We see that increasing thyroid problematics. We have many women have problems with the PCOS. We have the numbers are going down with the testosterone in men. So I think that that's also kind of like alerting within the food and nutrition science field. And I mean, that's kind of like generates more interest in seeing that, okay, what could be the underlying problem. And I think that one good thing is that we have social media actually today, which is kind of like people are also pressing the science a little bit, which I think is just positive, that the science is not in a own small bubble, but also that the science is kind of like coming in to people instead. Which is very important to kind of like generate this discussion on if we have some kind of like a big problem going on in terms of the recommendations, for example.
Without social media, we wouldn't be seeing the changes and the advances in this new nutritional way, which is primarily fatty meat based. Carnivore seems to be the growing one, but plant-based, where the message is so strong, and it's linked to that health and healthy diet and lifestyle that we so believe. Tell me a little bit about those people that were in your study. How did they feel about what they were doing, and how did they use that for their later health after the study was over?
Yeah, so basically, many of these women, they had first of all, I could see that many of them had worse gastrointestinal symptoms. If we were looking at 12 gastrointestinal symptoms, pretty much all of the women had at least 10 out of 12 gastrointestinal symptoms that they had. And I mean, of course, when collecting the data, there were people also contacting me in terms of the study, and I get always comments from people that how they were eating. Some people were doing a bit more plant-based. Some were feeling okay, but of course they were having pain. Some were doing a bit more carnivore-based or meat-based diets, and they were having like no symptoms whatsoever. What's interesting is that I feel that from the results I could see that many women were already, especially during their flare-ups, they were avoiding some food groups, and that could be often, for example, soy products. That could be some dairy products. I think that dairy can be very beneficial, but I mean, of course, because we're having the pasteurized version today, pretty much, so it can be very problematic. Many were avoiding, for example, some dried nuts, but actually many had still quite high intake of some cereals, for example, and bread, and they were still eating maybe pasta and so on. And that's also an interesting thing to ask, that, okay, when you are having more flare-ups, why are you eating more cereals? Is it due to the fact that it's kind of like easy food to take, but still these women were having pain? So I think that's one interesting conclusion to kind of like make, that could there be something to be changed, and also to kind of like informative in terms of the recommendations. Also, there were many women were avoiding gluten, and FODMAP is also something that some women are already doing. But what I could also see is that, for example, a very high nickel intake is related to worsened symptoms. What?
Nickel? What?
Yes, nickel.
From
that is basically from the plant-based foods. That could be as for example, from legumes, from tomatoes, nightshades. So I mean, especially if women are kind of like even going more towards lower carb diets, they might be including these foods that are actually triggering their symptoms, and that could be high nickel foods. And if you are eating that kind of like diet, that's also usually might include high intakes of gluten, For example, because also you also find it in cereals or in breads and so on. So that was also an interesting fight into kind of like, okay, should there be something discussed in terms of this area? Also, if women are excluding, for example, some plant-based foods, there should be definitely focus on the fermentable carbohydrates, taking away them, because they are kind of like making the IBS, the gut issues, even worse. And also these nickel foods, high nickel foods, which might be problematic.
I wonder if those that suffer from pain, and all of us have, if the food we eat as a carbohydrate gives us this initial feel better
Exactly.
effect, but then it later on contributes to the feel bad effect, and then we eat the food again to feel better because there's some opiate-like substances in the carbohydrates we eat, which have that drug effect of feeling better, but it's just a vicious cycle that we just can't get out of.
Exactly. I definitely think that, because I also asked the women how were they mentally feeling during these times, and of course now I don't have the answer, how did some specific food groups, for example, affect their feeling if they were eating these kind of like very high carby foods during their flare-ups. But there might be some kind of like trigger that, okay, I'm having this bread, it's kind of like easy to take, but it gives me some kind of like quite short term, some kind of like feel good feeling, but of course it aggravates the pain more. But it's interesting to still see in the results that it's all the women had worse kind of like mental, or they were feeling a bit more depressed, of course, during the flare-ups, but also that those women that had a higher intake, for example, of the cereals, they were having like more kind of like up and downs in there, how they were feeling, if we are comparing the flare-up period, because in this study I took a look at the flare-up period and then one normal week, basically. So there were a bit more fluctuation there, and those who were already avoiding these kind of like triggering foods, they had it a bit more stable over the time.
Can you tell us a little bit about your food habits today and how you're feeling, and any improvement in your symptoms of your diseases?
Absolutely. So first of all, when I was younger, in my teens, so at the moment I'm 29 years old, but when I was younger, so I started to experiment with paleo, and then kind of like transforming more to the low carb ketogenic diets. And so I would say that the changes has become, come like step by step. And today I'm pretty much animal based carnivorous. I'm still including some fruits, and some non-toxic vegetables, well-cooked vegetables, but mainly, I mean, I'm building up it's on meat only. But I had periods when I was quite ketogenic, like 1 year, 2 years, and I think that when I was younger, I had too little fat during the keto periods, and that's kind of like had an effect that didn't have I didn't get as the results as I was expecting. But adding up the fat, of course, it had a huge difference. In my early 20s, when I had problems with my menstruation, I just decided, because I was feeling so bad, that okay, now I'm just going to turn out the whole thing now here and start eating a quite strict ketogenic diet. And I did that maybe around 1 month. No, it was actually already after a couple of weeks. I actually got my period back all of a sudden. So it had been like for many like years now that I had had these period problems, and then I just got a regular period back. And that was like a big blessing, of course. That's like the biggest thing for women, that you are having your period back. So I got that back, and the underlying problems still there were at ketogenic diets, for example, and low carb diets still include a lot of vegetables. And I was still eating a lot of big salads and throwing a lot of raw vegetables, cucumbers, and having some tomatoes and different raw root vegetables even. And even at the times I still had like these smoothies, which was just totally crazy, because that I also get a very high intake of oxalates and anti-nutrients. So of course that is reflected on my thyroid levels then, that my hypothyroidism got worse when I having these oxalate high foods and very goitrogenic foods from for example cabbage and kale and so on. So then I now I decided I will cut down on these foods, and I mean shifting more towards just meat based. That's the priority. We start from there, and of course adding in the organ meats. I think that one of the big problems, especially as I feel I get the allergic histamine intolerance problems with some foods, and I mean eating too much muscle meat is also kind of like very problematic. So you need to really include the organ meats there. So adding up fats from saturated fats, cutting out seed oils I think that's what everyone should do. Seed oils, but I mean vegetables, I never really used vegetable oils really, but I was still eating, for example, tahini and nuts and seeds. And I also all the time had a little bit, loss on my face. I felt a bit, red on my face, and I had a lot of fluid in my body. I can just, if I'm looking at my IDs from a couple of years ago, I can definitely see that
Wow.
how much I had, this water weight in my body, and taking away all these trigger foods, and especially that was a lot in a plant foods that I had to take away. I started to, first of all, my thyroid levels started to kind of balance. I had quite high antibodies, thyroid antibodies even at the time, and they kind of like started to level out. So and my thyroid levels got better. So basically, I think that one of the main thing is that my gut started to work again. I had some constipation, I have bloating, problems to just digest the food. And the biggest thing is that you need to eat foods that are easily digestible. And the foods that are the most easiest digestible were the meat. And the fattier the meat, the better it was, basically.
Do you have any particular meats that you focus on?
I love lamb, actually. So I eat a lot of lamb meat. And then I also, of course, eat beef, a lot of beef, but I try to kind of like eat the nose to tail nutrition. Then, of course, we have some wild game here up north. So when it's possible to get wild game, I will eat that. Nose to tail, I mean, I'll eat a lot of, for example, oxtail. I eat all the parts of the body. It can be picanha sometimes. Sometimes it's the lamb leg. It's the chops. It's the chalk part. And then in terms of organ meats, it is pretty much liver, but also heart. Spleen I also be doing, and for brain I actually haven't never tasted, but also I have tried some lungs. But I think that in general, weekly I mainly eat liver and heart. And that's been a very good boost. And also I think that in terms that when you are having a thyroid problem that you are getting like all the minerals and you're getting enough copper, for example. And that can also be a big problem that especially when many have with the hypothyroidism, when get the diagnosis, they read, they Google and they read that, okay, I need to have more zinc, and they start to supplement with zinc, or they are just having a very high intake of zinc without getting enough copper. And especially in meat-based diets, there is a risk that if you don't include the organ meats, that you might end up having a bit lower intake of copper, because those two are, zinc and copper are antagonists. So it kind of like can cause problems if the other is too high and the other is too low. You get the they are unbalanced there. So I think that that's very important to kind of like have the organ meats in all the time. And I basically eat them every day in a smaller doses.
On the sense of fasting or meal timing, do you have any particular timings or hours without eating and things like that? What's your focus on that? And
yeah, that's an interesting question, because there I've been also actually trying a bit different perspectives on when it comes to especially fasting. So I love fasting, and I think that it's very easy for me, and it has some benefits. What I have noticed during the years is that if I'm having too long periods of fasting, it affects negatively my thyroid levels. But what I have found is that at the moment, what works very well for me is that I'm having around 8-hour window. Sometimes it might be 10-hour, but around 8-hour window when I'm eating, and I'm eating around in the morning when I wake up. I have been periods when I've been fasting, so that I maybe have had my first meal around 1 p.m. or something like that. But then I kind of like saw the negative effect on my thyroid. But switching it off, switching it into eating a bit earlier in the day, but I'm stopping eating a bit earlier in the day instead. So basically, let's say that I eat around 8, 9, and I stop eating around 4, 5. So that has worked pretty well, and my thyroid levels have been very stable. So I think that I try to check my thyroid levels quite frequently, and there I can see that works pretty well. And how often I eat, I'm definitely not advocating any kind of like 6, 8, 7, 8 meals a day. I rather eat 1-2 times per day. Usually it's 2 times a day, and I maybe have a bit bigger meal already in the morning. I don't really like to eat lunch, and I maybe in the later time when my window is kind of like ending, I have a bit bigger meal. Sometimes it might be just a fruit. I'm still including some fruit in my diet every now and then, but keeping it low. So about 1-2 times a day I usually eat, and it works well. And actually, even though I'm very active and I'm doing a lot of sport, I'm doing strength training, I'm doing martial arts, I feel that I don't really have the need to eat anymore, just that I'm kind of like covering my intake during those hours. Before, I have had my meal timing has been that my last meal was very late in the evening, because I'm often training quite late. But I just feel that it's kind of like affecting a little bit of my sleep when I'm stopping eating so late, if it's about 9 p.m. or something like that. So I've tried to shift my eating a bit earlier now, and I have really seen a very good results on that. And also in terms of, for example, strength training and muscle gain, I'm still building muscle very well at the moment.
do you think strength training is equally important or more important than aerobic exercise?
I would definitely say that with autoimmune diseases, I would rather, and in general also, I would rather focus on strength training actually than doing crazy amounts of cardio. I think that it also has a negative effect on cortisol levels. I know that I have earlier in my life had been periods when I'd be doing more cardio, and I can feel that it has a huge effect on my inflammation in my body. So I prioritize strength training, and I also think that it's extremely important if having any kind of like autoimmune disorders, because you want to kind of like build healthy ligaments, you want to have your bone density, work on that, and of course the cardiovascular effects of more cardio-based training is important. So it's a combination, but I think that we should be more focusing, and especially women should be more focusing on lifting weights. And I do heavy lifting, and I mean, many women maybe are a bit afraid of getting very bulky, but that's not the case. I think that it's also, investing in your health when you are having a good muscular, physique, but you are also increasing your bone density, doing a hardcore, heavy lifting. So because that's what we can see, in older people that that there is muscle loss is happening. Of course, you want to have that's the strength training is the best solution for that. So I'm definitely against this kind of like doing several hours, treadmill or by indoor cycling or something like that. And especially if you have any autoimmune diseases, you need to kind of like be quite mindful in terms of your training. And I would focus more on strength training.
We're not out in the fields or in the hunting, gathering, or building any longer. So we have to do the work we're probably meant to do to keep our muscles strong. And
Exactly.
and again, we've done. Can you tell us a little bit about the Black Pearl?
Oh, yes, Black Pearl. So I actually have it also here. So yes, Black Pearl. So this is earthenware by the company called Black Pearl. So it's a handmade clay pot, and I have some earlier experiences with clay pots, and it's also interesting because in terms of my background and food culture that we have in Finland, my family has been using clay pots earlier. But I think that one of the biggest difference with this clay pot is the material that they are using. Of course, in Moroccan tagine is something that probably some people are familiar with. But the difference in this is the material and the porosity and the form, of course. And I mean, the tradition of using clay pots go very long back. And in terms of using earthenware in cooking, it's of course because it's free from the so-called forever chemicals. It's kind of like trying to go back to the ancestral ways of cooking. And I mean, this product, for example, is fired in lower temperatures. So this means that it has also a more porous clay material, and they are using crushed stone to making it kind of like heat resistant. So meanwhile, some traditional other earthenware are fired in much more higher temperatures, and they have much finer clay, which also makes them a bit more brittle and sensitive. So how you use this product is that you can you can use it both in the oven, you can use it on a stove. It cooks the food much more it's much more gentle way to cook the food, which I also prefer in terms of my cooking. Slow cooking is what I definitely love, and it doesn't burn your food, but you can absolutely get a sear, for example, on your food. It's great to make meat, nose to tail foods, animal-based foods on it. You can throw it in the oven, you can have it on a stove, and I have actually also tried on an open fire as well. And I mean, one of the benefits, of course, is that it doesn't have chemicals, but also that it's preserving nutrients or making them even more available in the food. And yeah, I personally prefer cooking with lower temperatures, steam and cooking, and that's also what this product is good for.
I've been cooking my pork belly in the oven, and then taking the lid off and doing it under the broiler to sort of kind of get the nice char on it, which I like that little extra. So I put it under the broiler. I haven't put it on the stove yet. Tell us a little bit about, so where is the soil sourced for this, and where is it handmade?
So basically, these are handmade in Africa, and there is one family who is producing these products. Actually, this earthenware, and so also the company is supporting this kind of like soil movement, bring back the nutrients to the soil, which I think is of course very important. They are having a quite small batch of the products at the moment because it's of course handmade. And in terms of the material, because there has been a lot of trials to kind of like find the right porosity and how to make it more durable. So it has taken its own time, and of course producing the product to creating this right porosity in terms of using clay and some stone material is it's a kind of like handicraft. And it's interesting also, you know, it's quite nice to eat food from that you kind of like feel that it's handmade creation. It makes it gives it a totally different perspective, and I mean a different experience for the eating as well.
So if we go back to our ancient roots for cooking, it was either over the straight open fire or with some pottery of some sort that may not have been heated except in the open fire, and then food and it might have been cooked directly in that. What about soups and things like this? Are there any other pottery that the Black Pearl is making to make anything else? I'm a potter from way back, by the way. I've been making pottery for 50 years, so I'm really intrigued, and I've loved the Black Pearl. So maybe there's some other ways of producing it to add the soups and things. But I guess you could even do some soups within this with your meat and add the broth. And
definitely. Yes, I mean at the moment the company is only having this earthenware. And of course, when cooking the food, it still has some space for, especially, for example, for broth, of course, to have there. And if you are making it on a stove, you get quite a lot of, if you would call it sauce or broth from the food that you are making. But of course, that would be probably something to develop, you know, to having a bit more deeper pot to be able to even make different kind of like stews that are a bit more liquid, for example. So at the moment, for example, I very often fill the pot. If I have, let's say I have lamb leg, or if I have beef chuck, I fill it, and I fill it as much water as I can. And it might be that I have to add some water there, but at the end result is of course always some broth, which you can also use then to do something else, or use it only as a broth. So yeah, definitely. I'm not sure if it works to make a soup directly, but that's something to develop probably then further on.
Where can people find the Black Pearl?
You can find it Instagram page called Black Pearl. Let's go ancestral. And then there is a web page called Get Groceries, where you can also find the product. And the easiest, probably, if people are interested in the product and living in the US or somewhere else than in Europe, is to contact the company. And also, if getting the product, so I will be also, there is the possibility to have a consultation with me if you purchase the product.
We're putting a link for both the product and Sonja on Dr. Kiltz and also the Mighty Tribe, and getting more people to listen and learn about these really great different ideas. What other things are you working on besides the nutritional side to inspire people to gain better health and wellness?
Yeah, on side, well, of course, I'm focusing on health coaching, of course, but in terms of my own posting and social media visibility, I try to kind of like provide people information, educational information on what kind of like changes, what kind of, if they have any kind of like symptoms in terms of, for example, very much focus on thyroid health, for example, autoimmune disorders, what might be some triggers, what kind of like dietary changes could be relevant to be made there. And of course, in terms of my studies and my food science background, I'm working on to, especially there, to focus on lifting up these questions as well as I can. And also in terms of if there would be any further research I would be involved, I'm very open to kind of like including also people to give their feedback. What are areas that should be researched more, or kind of like shedding light on this bioavailability of our foods, that what is the most, let's say, species specific food for humans, and how would we be kind of like shifting the the eating patterns towards something else than what we are going now with the plant-based diets, for example.
Do you think plants and protein are essentially poisonous, and that's the link to all disease? So it's like a car: brakes go, carburetor goes, the engine goes, things break down, but they're all caused by the same problem, but we label them all as all different.
Absolutely. I think that what I can see in terms of, for example, gut-related issues that people have, and when I hear how much people are eating plant-based foods, how much they are eating legumes, I do believe that there is a very strong association that for example, vegetables can be poisonous to these people. Definitely, I've seen that on myself, but I've seen it in other people as well. And I think that even though we have different cooking methods, it doesn't always make it any better, actually. So excluding these foods make different huge differences in how people are feeling, and as well as in me. I actually also forgot to say that I have alopecia. So this is I have lost all my body hair several years ago, and that's also interesting because when I, for example, shifted to carnivorous diet, I have at the moment, I have regained all my eyelashes on my other eye, and also almost my eyebrows back. And I also have some hair growth back on my head and my scalp, which is very interesting, and even body hair. And that's also interesting because this is mainly because I have excluded mainly all the plant-based foods from my diet. So there definitely is an association.
Protein poisoning?
Protein poisoning, probably yes, of course. I think that there is a lot of focus on whether it's low fat or high protein, we kind of like forget the fat from the equation. So I'm not sure if protein itself is poisonous, but people are using it in a ratio way too high ratio in terms of having a very low fat intake. So especially in terms of, again, of gut related issues, what I see very often is that people maybe are eating a lot of protein, but they are having a very low fat intake. When they add up their fat and have it a bit more, a balance there, they get better. But of course, in the plant-based field, the protein, I think that plant-based proteins, you can never kind of like reach to the amino acid level with the protein. You are eating a very high protein diet with lots of legumes, with the lentils, with beans, etc., combining with rice and etc., and it's giving people more problems, especially with many autoimmune diseases. So I would say that at least people should focus a bit more on also highlighting the importance of fat, and especially saturated fat, and not just only focusing on protein, because saturated fats also are the backbone for all of our hormones.
So animal fat is
exactly
critical.
saturated fat from animal fats. Exactly.
I mean, I always, because what's a saturated fat? What's a linoleic acid? These are all things that are complicated stories, but animal fat is fit for a human. Plant oils are potentially toxic and damaging.
Exactly. And I think also it's important to kind of like notion the fact that how the ratio between omega-6 and omega-3 fats have shifted, so that we are having about 21 times higher intake of omega-6 fats, and that's mainly from the vegetables or seed oils. And even I think also that when it comes to animal fats, I think that people have to be mindful also getting the fats rather from ruminant animals. So if you are eating some, duck or chicken and so on, they might have higher intake of inflammatory omega-6 fats. So at least keep in mind that what kind of like diet even the animals have had. If they are monogastric animals, they might have a higher intake of omega-6 fats, which of course are also, you get it into your diet and it causes problems. So that's also important to notion.
So if you're eating ruminants, cows, lamb, to just name two of them, they're great sources of healthy fat, animal fat. But chicken, fish, and turkey, and I guess duck in some way, although duck tends to be fattier, but there were really no civilizations that lived on these things.
No.
Maybe fish in some ways, but they ate the entire fish, not just the fillet.
Exactly. And I think that it's very sad to see still, if you go to the grocery shop, you can see that, of course, the focus is a lot on chicken. And actually, it's interesting. I was on a lecture on where a representative from Swedish food agency were talking there, and of course the recommendations are going more towards, of course, plant-based, but also in terms of meat, we should probably eat more like white meats, and that's more chicken-based, which is kind of like against the how we are actually been used to eat, also from the ancestral perspective.
So chicken, but it's all boneless, skinless, white chicken, which ultimately is protein, which contributes to what we call rabbit starvation, chicken starvation, or protein poisoning, which is a big factor. And even red meat, any meat you buy, most of the fat has been eliminated.
That's so true. That's so true. If you go to grocery shop here, you will definitely only see cuts of meat that are, it's just only protein. So there is a relevant to actually talk about the as you mentioned, the protein poisoning. I mean, it's you need to get your fat instead, or cuts of meat from the butcher instead, and your fat from there, the animal fats from there. I mean, it's very hard to find fattier cuts of meat from grocery shop. I personally, I stopped buying my meat a couple of years ago from grocery shop. Okay, there might be time to times I might buy something there, but it's just shocking to see the chicken breast. They are also extremely big, and it's just only protein. And one of the problems I also see that if you go, for example, this kind of like traditional bodybuilding diet, which is very high in protein and quite high, very high in carbohydrate also, I mean, you start to kind of like almost you get more hungrier just due to the absence of the fat, animal fat, very high protein and high carbohydrate, and of course also the high protein intake, the high poisoning, effect from the protein. It's kind of like also is generated into glucose. So you are getting your blood glucose is very high all the time.
And you're not getting the fat, which is critical for your hormones, including testosterone. So many of the bodybuilders resort to supplements of taking testosterone injections or other means. And so they've defeated themselves in a high protein, plant-based, low animal fat diet. If they simply up the fats, they may improve, but ultimately the plants are poisonous no matter what amount you take, potentially. And the protein, I always say a 1-to-1 fat to protein at minimum, if not
Absolutely.
2 or 3-to-1 fat to protein. Do you have any comments on that?
I definitely follow about the same advice, and I do that also in my own diet. And I think that that's very important, especially all the women should be focusing more on their fat intake from animal fats. That's also very clear sign for me personally when I got my regular period back, is that I add up. I just totally shifted the ratio between protein and fat, more about 1-to-1 and even maybe higher. And that had an effect, and it actually starts to work pretty quickly when you do the shift. I mean, both getting your regular period, but also in terms of your libido, but also having much more stable thyroid levels. And also, I think it's also important to notice that, I mean, the gut healing effect. I mean, when you are having saturated fats has also the effect on, it has been very effective on, for example, gastritis that I was diagnosed when I was younger. Definitely adding up fat for females as well, and men also. I mean, the testosterone levels are totally going down at the moment. So that's effective.
Yeah, sperm function, morphology, motility, the count, and the volume is depleted significantly. Infertility, male and female, is going up tremendously. So you would say, in your experience, the fatty meat nutrition healed your gut, brought back your menstrual cycle, and eliminated your endometriosis symptoms.
Definitely. That's what has been happening now during the past years. And it's interesting because I haven't had to have a contact, for example, with the doctor in terms of my endometriosis the past couple of years, because I've been pretty much symptom free at the moment. And of course, it's interesting because women are the recommendations often say that, well, you should avoid eating meat if you have endometriosis or if you have any form of PCOS. And and it's ranked as, I mean, estrogenic foods. But what happens here is totally the opposite. So I have been pretty much pain-free the past couple of years, and haven't had any reason to do the treatments that are usually recommended in terms of the birth control pills or something like that. And it's a blessing, because the pain is terrible in other terms. And actually, it's also interesting when you are eating this way, carnivore-based diet. If I do any changes at the moment, if I eat something that gives me problems, and that could be very often, which also there have been a quite recent study, I think it was from 2019 or 18, which showed that, for example, cruciferous vegetables increase risk of endometriosis. So that's good to have in mind. It's often a food group that is recommended generally to eat. And also, I mean, fruits also, there is a limit. I have noticed that going too high up on carbs, the symptoms, my next menstrual cycle is much worse. So, and especially all these dried fruits, stuff like that, just keep away from them, definitely.
Sonja, are there any other questions that you wish I would have asked? And do you have any other thoughts and comments you want to share?
Yeah, I think that just how to maybe start, if anyone is how would I start if I would be starting a carnivore diet at the moment, or at least an animal-based diet, what to kind of like take an account there. And I think that it's first of all, for everyone, it's very important to cut out seed oils, eliminate seeds and nuts from the diet. That's the first thing. It takes time before the omega-6 levels, get down in your body. And if you have any kind of like chronic inflammation, before you start see any changes. And don't fall into the calorie counting roller coaster. Don't be afraid of the animal fats. Start your day off with fat and protein instead of a very carby meal. Focus on real food and nose to tail, no processed foods, and no condiments. And of course, seeing the ratio between protein and fat, adding up the fat there, at least 1-to-1 ratio. And avoid, of course, alcohol. And I would be also very careful with with any kind of like sugar sweeteners, because they have an effect, or have been, they might have an effect on blood glucose control, even though they are not adding up the calories or so on, and also the increased risk for cancer and so on. And focusing on grass-fed meat. And also, I think that everyone who is having any kind of like autoimmune background, just always try to see if you have low stomach acid. I've seen that so many times that people are having low stomach acid, as I also have. Is that very often it's said that, okay, you are having too high stomach acid, let's medicate this thing, and then you are end up having even more reflux. So I feel that many persons having IBS symptoms, for example, actually have a too low stomach acid, and especially those people who have low thyroid. So that would be eliminating trigger foods and sugar and raw vegetables, eating food that is easily digestible, and prioritizing your when your gut is feeling well.
Get a good coach, cheerleader, a mentor that can help give you some guidance is really, really important, Sonja. So we're going to put a link so people can learn what you have to share, which is so critical, important. And of course, for those that want to try the Black Pearl, we highly recommend it. And again, we'll have a link for everyone. So again, thank you for joining us and sharing your journey of helping all of us find health and wellness through a new social medicine way.
Lovely. Thank you for getting me in here.
All right. No,
Have a lovely day.
All right. You have a great day also. God bless.
God bless you. Bye.
Right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.